The noon sun beat down on the dust-choked main street as the whole town crowded outside the sheriff's office, where the auction block had been dragged into place. The women lined up like livestock, each with a rope loosely tied around her wrists and a tag pinned to her dress, as if she were nothing more than a number to be sold. 10 of them, in faded calico and sunburned faces, shifting on their feet under the stares of ranchers and drifters, the air thick with the low murmur of bids already being planned, and at the center, a tall man in a long, trail-worn coat leaned against a hitching post, hat pulled low over eyes that studied the scene with an unreadable stillness. The sheriff, fat from comfort and smug with authority, banged his gavel and called for the first bid, his voice carrying over the restless crowd. And as the first woman stepped forward, her jaw tight and eyes fixed on the ground, a rancher shouted a number that made the men around him chuckle. The tall stranger pushed off the post, walked forward without hurry, and when the sheriff's gaze flicked toward him, he simply said in a voice that cut through the heat, "I'll take her." The sheriff squinted, clearly sizing him up, but nodded and called the sale, and before the murmurs could die, the stranger pointed to the next woman and said, "I'll take her too." The crowd laughed uneasily, thinking it some kind of joke, until he kept going. Third, fourth, fifth. His voice calm, his gaze never wavering, each time cutting off any competing bids with the same 4 words. By the time he'd claimed the 6th, the laughter had died entirely, replaced by a stunned silence broken only by the wind dragging grit along the boardwalk. And when he said, "I'll take them all," the last 4 women included, the crowd erupted in whispers of disbelief. The sheriff, suddenly sweating, asked if he was prepared to pay, and without a word, the stranger dropped a leather pouch onto the block, the heavy thud of coins ringing like a church bell. A ripple moved through the crowd as men leaned to get a better look, silver flashing through the open mouth of the pouch, and the sheriff's face shifted into greedy satisfaction as he accepted it. The stranger turned to the women, all 10 staring at him with a mix of confusion and fear, and with a slow nod, he said quietly enough for only them to hear, "You're all coming with me." The townsfolk watched as he untied their ropes one by one, his hands careful, his movements steady, like a man handling fragile glass, and though not a single one of the women smiled, none resisted when he gestured toward the waiting wagon at the end of the street. The gossips whispered of insanity, of some secret desire that would shock them all, of trouble certain to follow, and yet no one stepped forward to stop him, not even the ranchers whose bids he'd crushed. By the time the last woman climbed into the wagon and the stranger took the reins, the sheriff was counting silver. The crowd was buzzing with speculation, and the women sat pressed together on the wooden bench, stealing glances at the man who had, in less than an hour, changed every path their lives had been on. As the wagon rolled out of town under the wide, blazing sky, one of the younger women finally dared to speak, her voice thin against the creak of wheels. "Why?" The stranger's eyes stayed on the road ahead, and though his answer was quiet, the steel in it made her heart stutter. "Because you were never theirs to sell." The wagon rattled along the rutted trail, the horses' hooves throwing dust in the wake of the man who had just bought 10 women as if purchasing an entire season's worth of cattle, and none of them knew if they had traded one prison for another. The older ones sat rigid, eyes darting between the open plains and the stranger's broad back, while the younger ones whispered in the shelter of their shawls, trying to guess his intentions. When the road forked, instead of turning toward the mountains where most large ranches stood, he veered toward a stretch of open land fringed by cottonwoods, where the sound of water could be heard over the creak of the wagon. They passed no homestead, no fences, just miles of grass that shimmered under the late afternoon sun, until they reached a cluster of half-built cabins, some no more than frames and stacked logs, others standing but empty. He pulled the wagon to a stop and swung down without looking back, untying the horses with the ease of a man who had worked alone for years, and then turned to them at last. "Get down," he said simply, and though some hesitated, they obeyed, one by one, their boots hitting the packed dirt in uneasy unison. When they were all standing before him, he studied them, not like a man appraising beauty or strength, but as if weighing something else entirely, perhaps the weight of what he was about to say. "I didn't buy you to keep," he told them, the words landing heavy in the warm air. Confusion rippled through them, and a red-haired woman with a scar at her temple frowned and demanded, "Then why?" His gaze flicked toward the cabins, then back to them. "Because those men would have worked you until you broke, or worse. I've got a piece of land, some shelter, and a plan. You can stay here as long as you need. You can leave when you're ready." It took a moment for the meaning to sink in, and even then suspicion lingered, because in their world no man spent silver like that without expecting something in return. One of the younger girls, barely 17 and clutching her shawl like a shield, whispered, "And what if we can't leave?" The stranger's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the strain of holding himself steady. "Then you stay until you can." He turned away before they could ask more, heading toward a stack of lumber, and began working with the rhythm of someone who had long ago learned to fill silence with labor. The women exchanged looks, their mistrust warring with a strange flicker of hope that had not dared surface in years. A tall widow in a faded blue dress stepped toward him, her voice quiet but firm. "What's your name?" He paused only long enough to adjust his grip on the hammer. "Call me Hale." She nodded, as if that single word gave her enough to hold on to. That night, they slept in the cabins, 2 or 3 to a room, on floors swept clean but bare, the sound of the river outside mingling with the occasional crack of wood as the cabins settled in the cool air. Some lay awake, staring into the dark, certain there had to be a catch, while others, those who had endured the worst, let the rhythm of water and wind lull them for the first time in years. Hale kept watch by the dying fire outside, his rifle across his knees, scanning the tree line for movement, knowing full well the town wouldn't let him walk away with 10 women without someone coming to collect what they believed was theirs. The morning broke pale and sharp, the kind that made the river steam like breath in the cold air, and Hale was already stacking firewood by the main cabin when the distant thud of hooves rolled across the plains. The women emerged from their cabins in small, hesitant clusters, drawn by the sound, some clutching shawls tighter, others gripping the cabin doorframes as if bracing for a storm. Hale didn't need to count the hoofbeats to know there were too many for a friendly visit. 6 at least, maybe more, and he could already see the dark smudges of riders cresting the far rise. He set down the wood, not in alarm, but in a deliberate motion that said he had expected this. Without turning to them, he told the women to get inside and stay away from the windows, his voice even, like a man telling someone to mind a boiling kettle. They hesitated, torn between fear and the urge to see, but the older widow, the one in the faded blue dress, caught their eyes and jerked her chin toward the doors, her own posture leaving no room for argument. Hale stepped into the open, his long shadow cast by the low sun, and waited. The riders came fast, their horses lathered, the men's faces grim under their hats. When they reined in a dozen yards away, the leader, a thick-set man with a gold tooth that flashed when he spoke, didn't bother with greetings. "You've got something that don't belong to you," he said, his gaze sliding toward the cabins where he knew the women were hidden. Hale's eyes didn't follow his, didn't give away a thing. "I paid for them," he said, the words calm, but laced with steel. "Paid more than they were worth to you, apparently." The gold-toothed man's grin thinned into something uglier. You think money changes the fact they were spoken for? Some of them owe debts. Some belong to men who won't be too kind when they hear what you've done. Hale didn't blink. They belonged to no one now. Behind him, the women could hear every word, the thin cabin walls no match for voices sharpened by the cold. The younger ones clung to each other. The older ones watched the crack between the shutters, their breath fogging the narrow slats of light. One of the men shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the butt of his revolver, and Hale saw it but didn't move. Instead, he said quietly, "You can ride back and tell them they're not coming, or you can try to take them and see how far you get." The silence that followed was taut as wire, the only sound the river and the horses' restless snorts. Then the gold-toothed man spat into the dirt, the dark stain spreading like a warning. "This ain't over," he said, turning his horse. The others wheeled with him, hooves pounding as they disappeared back over the rise. Hale didn't watch them go. He stood still until the sound was gone, then turned back toward the cabins. "It's starting," he said simply, and though none of the women asked what he meant, they all felt the truth in it. The reprieve was over. Tonight, they would sleep knowing that somewhere out there, men were planning to come back. And next time they might not just ride away. By afternoon, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere far off, and Hale knew the riders wouldn't wait long before trying again. He had seen that kind of grin before, the kind that meant men were already deciding who got which prize when they came back. Inside the main cabin, the women were gathered around the big table, the air thick with the smell of strong coffee and the sharp tang of tallow candles burning low. They all looked up when Hale stepped in, his hat still on, his eyes scanning each face. "This isn't a rescue," he said flatly. "This is a stand. If any of you think you'd rather take your chances with them, now's the time to go." No one moved. A few of the younger women lowered their eyes, but their shoulders stayed square. The widow in the blue dress spoke first. "We've run before, and it never works. If you're standing, we're standing." Hale gave a single nod, the kind that ended a conversation, and began pulling a box from under the table, its wood worn smooth by years of handling. When he flipped the lid, the dull gleam of rifles and ammunition caught the candlelight, and there was a sharp intake of breath from one of the girls. "You all know how to shoot?" he asked. Only 2 hands went up, one belonging to a freckled redhead barely past 16, the other to a stern-faced woman who looked like she'd been carved from oak. "Then you'll learn," Hale said, and laid a rifle across the table. His voice was matter-of-fact, without bravado, as he explained how to load, aim, and fire, making each of them hold the weapon until the awkward stiffness in their grip eased a little. Outside, the light was starting to sink toward the horizon, washing the plains in gold, and Hale led them to the edge of the yard where tin cans sat on fence posts. The first few shots were clumsy, the kicks surprising, but soon the clang of lead on tin began to ring in the cold air, and with it came a shift in their faces, fear tempered with something harder. Between reloads, Hale moved to the barn, where his old chestnut gelding stood saddled, packs already strapped down. He had sent a boy from the neighboring ranch earlier in the day with a message to a few men he trusted, and by sundown he expected at least one to ride in. Sure enough, as the shadows lengthened, the sound of a single set of hoofbeats approached, and a tall rider appeared, his long coat trailing dust, a repeating rifle slung over his back. He swung down without a word and clasped Hale's hand in a grip that said more than any greeting. "Heard you stirred up trouble," the newcomer said, his eyes flicking to the women standing near the fence, some still clutching rifles. "Trouble found me," Hale replied, "but now we're ready for it." The man's gaze returned to the plains beyond, where the horizon was already dimming into the kind of dark that could hide anything, or anyone. "If they come tonight," he said, "they'll wish they'd stayed in town." The women shifted closer together, their breaths making small clouds in the cooling air, and for the first time since the morning, there was no trembling in their hands. The first line had been drawn, and it would not be crossed quietly. The sun was sinking low when the first echo of hoofbeats rolled over the plains, not the steady rhythm of a lone rider, but the uneven thunder of several horses coming hard. Hale was on the porch in 2 strides, his eyes narrowing as dust plumed on the horizon and shapes began to form. 4 men in wide-brimmed hats, riding like they owned the land, their silhouettes dark against the flaming sky. Inside the cabin, the women froze where they stood, coffee cups forgotten, every ear straining. Hale didn't shout or bark orders. He just said, "Positions!" And the room snapped into motion, each woman taking the place they'd practiced, rifles in hand, hearts pounding so loud they could hear their own pulse. The tall newcomer, Flint, stepped out from the barn with his rifle resting easy in his grip, leaning against the post like he had all the time in the world, but his eyes were locked forward. The riders didn't slow as they crossed the yard's edge. The leader, broad-chested, with a scar splitting one eyebrow, calling out in a voice meant to carry. "We'll take what's ours, and you can keep the rest. Step aside, cowboy." Hale didn't move. "Nothing here belongs to you?" That earned a chuckle from the men flanking the leader, but the sound had an edge, the kind that meant guns could come up any second. Hale's gaze swept the yard once, marking where each woman stood, then settled back on the leader. "You've got 1 chance to turn around." The answer came in the sharp crack of a pistol, the bullet splintering the wood post inches from Hale's head. In that instant, the air exploded with sound, the deep bark of Flint's rifle, the sharper reports from the women's positions. One rider pitched sideways, his boot caught in the stirrup as his horse bolted, dragging him into the dust. Another clutched his shoulder and spun his mount, disappearing into the smoke and chaos. But the leader spurred forward, firing wildly, his horse pounding toward the porch. Hale stepped down into the yard, meeting him head-on, his own revolver spitting flame. The horse screamed and reared, the leader toppling hard into the dirt, his gun skittering away. He rolled to grab it, but a rifle barrel pressed to his temple froze him cold. The widow in the blue dress, her eyes steady, breath sharp in the cooling air. Around them the yard fell silent except for the ragged breathing of horses and the slow, deliberate steps of Flint as he checked each downed man. 2 were gone, fleeing hard toward the darkening horizon. 1 lay groaning in the dust, clutching his side. And the leader. Hale hauled him up by the collar and dragged him to the edge of the fence. "Ride back to town," Hale said low, "and tell them the next time they come here they won't be riding back at all." The man's mouth twisted into something between hate and fear, but he didn't argue. He swung up onto the nearest loose horse and bolted into the growing night. Only when the sound of hoofbeats faded did Hale lower his weapon, turning to find the women standing firm, rifles still in hand, their faces lit by the last fierce blaze of sunset. They had been tested, and they had not broken. Long after the dust had settled and the horses' hoofbeats were gone, the women gathered in the main room, rifles stacked in the corner, but tension still crackling in the air. Hale moved among them, checking for injuries, speaking little, his eyes unreadable. Flint leaned in the doorway, his face shadowed except for the faint glint in his eyes. "They weren't here just to scare us," he said finally, voice low but carrying. The widow in blue crossed her arms. "Then what did they want?" Flint's gaze shifted to Hale, and for a long moment the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. "They were looking for someone," Hale said at last, the words heavy. One of you." The room went still, every breath held. Maria, the youngest, shook her head. "We don't know anyone like them." Hale crouched, stoking the fire, though it didn't need tending. "They weren't after a name," he said. "They were after a face." He turned then, eyes sweeping over the women, stopping when they reached Sarah, the quiet one with dark hair always tied back, who rarely spoke. She paled under his stare. "Me," she whispered. The others turned toward her, questions on their lips, but Hale raised a hand. "Tell them." Her hands trembled where they gripped the back of a chair. "Back east, there was a man. My father owed him money. When he couldn't pay, he promised me instead." A murmur rippled through the women, but she pressed on, voice shaking. "I ran before he could take me, but he sent men after me. Men who said they'd drag me back if they had to." Flint swore under his breath. "And that scar-eyed devil leading them tonight, that was his hound." Sarah's eyes glistened, but her chin lifted. "If they think I'm going back, they'll have to kill me." Hale's jaw tightened. "They won't take you. Not while I'm breathing." For the first time, the women saw something break in his usual calm. The flash of a promise he meant to keep, even if it meant blood. But Flint stepped forward, his voice as sharp as the edge of a blade. "You need to understand. They'll be back. And not just for her. They'll come for everything, food, shelter, and every woman here. They've marked this place now." The fire popped, throwing sparks up the chimney. No one spoke for a long time, the weight of the truth pressing down. Finally, Hale said, "Then we don't wait for them to ride in again. We take the fight to them." A few of the women exchanged uneasy glances. "Out there?" Maria asked. Hale nodded. "Out there. Tonight we plan. Tomorrow we make sure they never cross this fence again." And in that moment, the fear that had wrapped around them since sundown began to shift, into something sharper, stronger. Determination. They might have come here as strangers, but if they were going to survive, they would have to fight like family. The lamps were turned low, their glow spilling over the long table where Hale had spread a rough map of the surrounding land, marked with smudges of charcoal for ridges, gullies, and the narrow road the gang would have to take. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but the room was heavy with the sound of breathing and the occasional scrape of a chair as someone leaned closer. "We can't outnumber them," Hale began, his voice even, "so we have to outthink them." Flint stood at his shoulder, tapping the map where the creek cut across the road. "Here. It's narrow enough they'll have to slow down. We block it, box them in." The widow in blue, who had spent years driving cattle, shook her head. "If they're smart, they'll split. Half will come up the ridge to flank us." Hale looked up. "Then we put someone on the ridge, someone fast." Maria's hand shot up. "I'll do it." Hale's gaze softened, but he shook his head. "You're quick, but we need you here with the others. This is going to take every shot we've got." He pointed to Sarah, the one they were after. "You'll stay in the loft above the barn. From there, you'll have a clear line of sight to the road. If they get past us, you take the lead rider down." Sarah swallowed hard, but nodded, her fingers tightening on the rifle Flint had given her. Flint leaned on the table, eyes sweeping the women. "You all have two choices. Fight or hide. But if you hide, you're betting they won't find you. I wouldn't put money on that." One by one, the women spoke up, some with quiet determination, some with voices shaking but steady enough to be heard. None chose to hide. Hale handed out weapons, checking each one himself, loading bullets into hands that had never held them before tonight. "Don't shoot to scare them," he said. "Shoot to end it." Maria asked the question everyone else had avoided. "And if we lose?" Hale paused, then spoke in that low, unyielding tone that seemed to anchor the room. We won't lose. Flint grinned without humor. And if we do, they'll regret winning. The room gave a short, collective laugh that felt almost like courage. Plans were made, roles assigned. Someone fetched the extra lantern oil. Another sharpened the long knives meant for skinning deer. In the corner, Sarah sat on a stool, loading shells into her rifle one by one, her lips moving in a silent prayer. By the time the table was cleared and the map rolled away, the night outside had deepened into a hard, cold black, the kind that swallows sound. Hale told them to get what rest they could, but no one really slept. Some sat by the fire, staring at the flames. Others paced, fingers twitching toward the weapons resting nearby. In the barn loft, Sarah lay with her rifle beside her, staring out at the road she knew they'd come down, her mind replaying Hale's words. They won't take you. Not while I'm breathing. The promise felt like a shield, but she knew shields could break. Somewhere out in the dark, the gang would be gathered too, sharpening blades, loading guns, whispering names they planned to claim. The fight was coming, and it would arrive with the first light of dawn. The horizon was only a faint wash of gray when Hale stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching over frost. The air was brittle, the kind that burned the lungs, and the silence was so complete it felt wrong, like the land itself was holding its breath. He scanned the road to the east, the narrow line that cut between the skeletal cottonwoods and the frozen creek. Beside him, Flint emerged, hat pulled low, eyes narrowing. They'll come with the sun at their backs, Flint muttered, and Hale just nodded, jaw tightening. Inside the barn, the women were already at their posts. Maria crouched behind hay bales with her shotgun, the widow in blue kneeling beside the loft ladder, eyes sharp. Sarah lay prone in the loft window, her rifle trained on the bend in the road. Her heart thudded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, but her breathing stayed steady, each inhale turning to mist in the cold. Down in the yard, Hale adjusted the barricade they'd made from an overturned wagon and stacked firewood, checking the line of sight through the gaps. "Remember," he said over his shoulder, "don't move until you see my hand drop." Flint gave a thin grin. "And if your hand doesn't drop, then you'll know we're already dead," Hale replied without looking back. The words hung in the air like frost before sinking into silence again. Then, faint at first, but growing, hoofbeats, slow, measured. Not the rush of a wild charge, but the steady, confident rhythm of men who believed no one would stand in their way. Over the ridge they came. 6 riders first, then another 5, their silhouettes black against the brightening sky. Behind them, a wagon rolled, and even from a distance Hale could make out the iron cage bolted to its bed. The gang leader rode at the front, a tall figure with a scarred face and a long coat that flared with each stride of his horse. He sat too still, eyes locked on the ranch as though he could already see the people inside. They didn't slow when they saw the barricade. Instead, the leader raised a hand and the men fanned out, some to the ridge, others toward the creek. Hale's stomach turned. Flint had been right. "Ridge!" he barked, and Maria was already moving, sprinting for the side fence with 2 others at her heels. From the loft, Sarah followed the movement through her scope, catching flashes of gunmetal between the brush as the flankers moved in. She forced herself to breathe, to wait for the signal. The leader reined in his horse just short of the wagon, standing high in the stirrups as he scanned the barricade. "You've got one chance," he called, voice carrying across the frozen yard. "Send her out, and the rest of you can walk." Hale didn't answer. He just lifted his hand slowly, palm open to the sky. Sarah's muscles locked. Was this the moment? The leader smirked, his eyes sliding toward the barn loft like he knew she was there. The hand dropped. Gunfire exploded from both sides, the crack of rifles and the roar of shotguns blending into a single deafening wave. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the ranch yard turned to chaos. Sarah fired, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, and through the scope she saw the lead rider pitch backward into the dirt. Below, Hale was already moving toward the next gap in the barricade, shouting orders over the gunfire. The fight they'd waited for all night had begun, and there would be no stopping it until someone lay dead in the snow. The yard was a blur of smoke and movement, every sound sharpened into something raw, shouts torn from throats, the hammer click of rifles, the panicked screams of horses rearing against reins. Hale ducked behind the wagon just as a bullet tore through the wood beside his head, splinters catching in his cheek. "They're pushing the left!" Flint's voice cut through the din, and Hale swung around the barricade, firing twice toward the ridge. One man went down, tumbling into the snow, but another took his place instantly, advancing low. From the loft, Sarah's rifle barked, and that second man dropped mid-stride. Hale caught her eye for a half-second, a quick nod, and then he was moving again, vaulting over a trough to get to Maria's side. She was crouched behind stacked crates, loading shells with hands that shook only when they paused. "They'll break us if they get to the barn," she warned. Hale glanced over the crates. The leader was there now, dismounted, coat flaring as he stalked forward with a revolver in each hand, shouting orders sharp enough to cut through the chaos. Hale's pulse kicked harder. This wasn't just a fight for the women. This was personal. He rose from cover and advanced, each step slow, deliberate, the world narrowing until there was only that scarred face ahead of him. The leader saw him and grinned like a man spotting an old rival across a card table. "You again," he said, his voice somehow calm amid the storm. "Last time you ran." "Last time I wasn't fighting for 11 lives," Hale shot back, closing the distance. Gunfire cracked around them, but for a moment it felt like the rest of the battle faded, the two men circling in the churned snow. The leader fired first. Hale dove sideways, rolling into the churn of hooves and boots, the shot grazing his coat. Hale came up firing, and the leader staggered back, the revolver slipping from his left hand. Before Hale could finish it, one of the gang rushed him from behind. They slammed into the snow, rolling, the man's knife flashing. Hale grabbed the wrist, forcing it down until the blade bit into the dirt, then wrenched free and drove his elbow into the man's jaw. The gang leader was raising his remaining revolver when a shot rang from the loft, Sarah's shot, and the weapon spun from his grip, clattering across the snow. Hale surged forward, slamming into him, both men going down hard. They grappled, boots slipping, fists swinging in bursts of rage and survival. The leader caught Hale under the chin, but Hale answered with a hook that sent him sprawling. All around, the battle turned. Flint's voice rose in a rallying cry, the women firing from every angle, driving the gang toward the creek. Horses bolted, some dragging their riders through the drifts. The leader, bleeding from his temple, stumbled to his feet, eyes darting between Hale and the open field beyond. "It's not over," he hissed. "It is for you," Hale replied, grabbing him by the coat and driving him back into the snow. Before the leader could rise again, Maria was there, shotgun leveled. Hale met her eyes, then stepped back. The leader froze, chest heaving, as the barrel stayed trained on his heart. The last of the gang was breaking, the sound of retreat cutting through the gun smoke. But Hale knew better than to think it was done, not until the leader was in chains, or in the ground. The snow around them was littered with bodies, hoof prints, and the bitter stink of black powder. This was the last stand, and it would be decided in the next breath. When the smoke finally thinned, the air felt heavier than before, the stillness after chaos pressing down like a weight. Hale stood in the churned snow, boots wet through, hands raw, watching as Flint and Maria bound the gang leader's wrists with a length of rope stripped from the corral, The man's eyes still burned with hatred. But there was something else now. An edge dulled, the first crack in his certainty. The rest of the gang had fled, or lay still in the snow, their horses scattered into the frosted fields. Inside the barn, the women were emerging one by one, stepping into the pale morning light like shadows stepping out of a long night. Sarah descended from the loft, slowly, rifle in hand, scanning the yard as though half expecting the fight to flare up again. Hale caught her eye and gave the smallest nod. She returned it, her lips pressing together to hold in the tremble of relief. He didn't waste time. Every minute here was another minute for the gang to regroup somewhere else. By midday, the 11 women, bundled against the cold, were loaded into the wagons. The leader was tied to a saddle, flanked by Flint and Maria, and the convoy rolled toward the town. Snow crunched under hooves and wheels, the creak of leather and wood the only sound for a long while. The women didn't speak. Their eyes stayed on the road ahead, but now and then one would glance toward Hale with an expression that held gratitude and disbelief in equal measure. As they neared the edge of town, people began to spill into the street. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, children darting between skirts to get a better look. Whispers passed like wind through dry grass. The gang was broken, the women were safe, and Hale McCrae had done it without losing a single soul. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, the crowd had swelled, pressing in from all sides. The sheriff, an older man with a graying mustache, stepped forward to take custody of the leader. "You'll hang," he said simply, and the gang leader didn't bother to answer. Hale helped each woman down from the wagon, his big hands steadying them as their boots hit the packed snow. When Sarah stepped down, she didn't let go of his arm right away. Instead, she leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "You didn't just save us," she whispered. "You gave us back the right to choose what comes next." Hale didn't answer. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't break the moment. But he reached up, adjusted her scarf against the cold, and stepped back as the sheriff led the women into the courthouse to give their statements. The crowd began to cheer then, loud and fierce, voices echoing off the storefronts. Hale stood for a moment, letting the sound wash over him, and then turned away, walking down the street toward the livery. He'd brought them here alive. He'd kept his promise. And now, like always, he'd leave before anyone decided to make him something more than he was. But, as he passed the edge of the crowd, Sarah's voice called after him. Not loud, but clear enough to stop him in his tracks. "If you ever decide to stay," she said, "there's a place at my table." Hale didn't turn, but his hand lifted in a small wave before he kept walking. The snow was falling again, soft and clean, covering the tracks of what had come before. Somewhere behind him, 11 women were free, and in the heart of a town that had just watched it happen, the story of the cowboy who married them to save their lives was already becoming legend.